Hey group, Ian Gordon here. Short video about evidence synthesis screening as it pertains to the project that we're involved with as well. It should be short and sweet, but it maybe help you provide context on why we're doing this and how to do it effectively as well. Why do a scoping review? Authors identified 4 reasons: to identify the extent, range, and nature of available research on a topic or question. We've kind of sense that there's enough out there, probably too much, where it is, how to search for it, and whether this research question we're looking at may be answered. We've already kind of determined that. To determine the value of undertaking a full systematic review, I don't think that's part of the project, but many people do preliminary research like this and then step in and do a full systematic review, which involves more rigor, more requests, and usually involves data as well. To summarize and disseminate research findings across the body of research evidence, just to see what's out there, and then communicate back to a scholarly community or a practicing community why this is important. And lastly, to identify research gaps in literature to aid planning and commissioning of future research. So this isn't the scholarly, but maybe it's the practical side to help teachers, educators, other researchers where the gaps are, how things have changed since this was done extensively. So several reasons of why doing a scoping review. And they also asked us why do a scoping review, and here's the percentages of responses, which is kind of interesting. Near the bottom is identify key themes, so a small number of people did it for that reason. And so when we craft a manuscript, our analysis may be to identify emergent themes that may be helpful to teachers or researchers or scholars in this area. So there's many reasons of why doing a scoping review and why choosing this methodology in the evidence synthesis suite of tools. So here's the steps we've kind of done with. We're starting objects of the research, so we've kind of nailed that down. Identifying eligibility criteria for studies to be included and excluded. We've kind of done that, though it's a work in progress. Identified all potential eligible studies. I've kind of done that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And your job is to screen for inclusion and exclusion. Then extracting data from the final set of screened studies. How we do that may pertain to what we think we found from the body of research. Praising the final set of studies. That's a topic that you may be able to do. It's a table that helps contextualize what we found and what's important about and why we decided to include those citations. A statistical analysis, it probably won't be done, but if applicable, and preparing a structured report of research or a manuscript for publication. So here's our research questions. What literature currently exists? Behavior analytical interventions involving group contingencies within educational settings. So we've got many ways to look at that. And another question that we're trying to answer is what type of group contingencies have been proven to be effective within educational settings. It's pretty consistent, and it's pretty easy, you think, but there's so many moving parts because we're dealing with education, we're dealing with a particular technique, population. Are we looking at the students, or are we looking at the teachers? Has this changed over the years? And would it have proven to be effective? How do we determine whether that's true or not? So it looks like an obvious thesis or dissertation or capstone project research question, but there's always more to it, as you know. So we did a research searches, and I searched these databases. We didn't search Scopus. We could. I didn't think we needed to, but we don't have it at Brock anyways. And for all these numbers of citations, I found and uploaded to Zotero, and we'll upload to Covenants. We limited all of them by English language and by format, meaning we just look for scholarly articles. Though the filters work and don't work, you may trip across things that aren't in those languages or that formats. That's why we screen. And we found a total of 1,528 studies, but Covenants will dedupe these, so I speculated that we'll probably have half of these, which is a small number of citations to screen, so we really have to look carefully at them. And then at the bottom is an example of my research strategy for Web of Science. I looked at everything on group within 2 words, the word contingency or contingencies, in the title, abstract, keywords, subject or controlled vocabulary of every citation in all these databases. Then I asked how many of these had any one or all of these or some of these keywords, phrases, or acronyms as well. So that's the limitation. It's not a perfect search strategy, but it seems to work with practice searching as well. The important thing to remember is we want to increase the reproducibility, transparency, and rigor of this study. It's a hallmark of evidence synthesis work, and we want to limit the amount of bias, whether it's a disciplinary bias, a group bias, or more importantly, individual biases. When you do inclusion, exclusion, you need to be consistent. Need to share how we do this and don't do this, because we all need to be on the same page doing this when we're screening and actually looking at the studies as well. So inclusion and exclusion criteria. Inclusion criteria are elements or resources that must be present in order to meet the needs of your research topic. Here's examples. Your inclusion criteria is all versus any. So all the citations should meet all the criteria, inclusion criteria. So it should be peer reviewed. So it's hard to tell from a citation abstract peer review whether it's done or not. Published in the last 5 years, you may or may not see that. So it's a tricky thing to know the date. You'll look at it when we do full text citations. English only resources. So, well, some articles have English citations and abstracts but are in Portuguese, but we've done the best we can, including some that are English. Not that things that are not in English may be relevant. They may be hugely important, but that's the boundaries we put on this particular study. And here's the tricky one. Resources focused on study of specific population. So we're looking at children. How do you define children? If we find an article in children and youth and adolescents or infants or adults, do we still include it or not? That's the gray area that we need to discuss as a group as well. Then exclusion. So if inclusion is all, exclusion is any. We exclude a study if it meets any, just one of these criteria. We say, nope, get rid of it. We're not going to use it. These are elements of resources that, if found, would disqualify them from being used in the final review. So here's examples. Letters, studies, resources, methodological considerations. I think our inclusion and exclusion criteria is pretty tight, but you could also look at this another way. You could say all our inclusion criteria is benchmarked against exclusion criteria, or just the opposite. So if the inclusion criteria says we're just looking at peer-reviewed journal articles, your exclusion criteria could be if it's not a scholarly peer-reviewed article. So you're trying to get away from that. But remember the all inclusion versus any exclusion, knowing that there's always gray areas of discussion. So here's the group contingencies you'll have in hand. We can include these in covenants. I think we may not do that, but you'll have these right beside your site. So you look at a citation and abstract for the first level screening. Does it meet the all of inclusion, or does it meet any of the exclusion? And are there any ideas that you want? So when I do screening, I look at these and think like the group. In titles and abstracts, you always err on saying yes and maybe, only know if it's obvious, and then take notes. So your notes would be, oh, his study, I don't know, or you need to talk about this as a group as well. So these aren't perfect, but these are the inclusion and exclusion criteria that are pretty tight. Here's an example of a citation. So in covenants, you'll have a profile, we'll set it up, and you'll look at a citation and abstract and include inclusion, exclusion, or maybe. Inclusion meaning yes, exclusion meaning no. So that's all the information they get you. You can't tell the dates there. That we don't really care about data right now, but track that if you want. Subjects aren't here. Tables, figures. So sometimes not all the literature you need, but usually you can make an obvious yes or no. And I always err on maybe when doing title and abstract screening. Here's a full text screening, and in this particular study, again, this is another type of study, there's no maybe, and the full text isn't provided, but you can click on it and it'll upload the full text for you to look at it as well. But it's a yes-no topic. And what happens is some of you will say yes and some will say no, and so the software automatically puts it into another set for the additional reviewers to review and make a final decision. So you want to be consistent with each particular citation that you look at. And the first time you look at one citation, you should look at it just as seriously as the last one. So screening fatigue is a real issue as well. When we set up covenants, and I'll help people to do this, it'll tell you how many studies you do. It'll tell you how you're doing, who's involved, and who makes the initial screening for titles and abstracts, and then for full text, and who breaks conflicts. And so different people are given different permissions. But through this process, the covenant software doesn't allow you to see the names, the anonymity of somebody else. And so it just records votes and doesn't include those votes with your names on them as well. So you may know or not know as well. Even when you go to conflicts, they won't know. They'll just know one person or two people said yes, and one person or no people said no. And they have to break those based on the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So it gives you a progress report, so you can start on a Monday and do 20, you can do 20 next day. So it keeps track of that, which is really nice. And it tells you when you're done, how many you just screen, and it keeps you in the queue, which is really nice, not only for titles and abstracts, but for full text review as well. Covenant software, as you can see on the bottom, is usually used for extraction as well. I mean, it takes data, so it has additional level of screening. We won't be doing that for this particular study. We'll be looking at the final set of numbers of citations after titles and abstracts and after full text screening, and looking at each one of those citations separately. Here's another review. One I did as well. It's just set up differently. It tells you how it works, how far you're doing. It's my review summary. And when you're done, it pushes everything to a decision tree so that people who do these breaking ties look at it as well. So we can tell how far you've gone and what you've done, but you can't tell who's done what and what decisions have been made by other people. That's been done, is you can set this up. It's pretty flexible and really an amazing tool. So title and abstract screening, you can actually include on the right-hand side decisions in the exclusion tree of why you excluded that. So not only do you say no, but then a screen pops up like this and it asks you to click on one or two or any number of decisions why you didn't include this. I don't think we're going to do this for this particular study, but it's a process and it can be done, and it can be incorporated, and this will finally end up probably as a decision tree in the Prisma flowchart I'll show you at the end. Text screening looks a bit differently, but it looks almost the same. You'll be in a different queue, you'll be moving through it, and they'll just come up for include or exclude. And we can upload the full text, or you can go to the full text by the links that are provided as well. These are all options. It's a pretty flexible piece of software. So at the very end, not only is the titles and abstract screening resolving conflicts, but the full text as well. So this will look for the people that are doing the final screening, excluding when there's conflicts. You as screeners, primary screeners won't see this, but the principal investigators of the study will. So here's that Prisma flowchart. I know it's kind of hard to see. So we started with so many citations. We found so many duplicates that were removed by the software. Everybody went through and did their screening for titles and abstracts, and then they found this many. Then they screened for full text citations using the same or a different type of screening criteria. And here they found 14, and they see the decisions of why you excluded them on the side, which we may or may not do. And then it came down with 7. So you could ask, well, how many are we supposed to get? We won't know until we move through this process as well. Questions? Well, things that we can talk about as a group, or you can talk to me, or we can do this by chat. What to do if I can't make up my mind to include or exclude? Notes do I keep, and where do I keep them? You can keep them in the software, or you can keep them on pen and paper, or you can just talk them into it. You could say, this citation, I couldn't make up my mind for a reason, and we need to talk about this as a group. And you usually tag the evidence number for that particular citation, or you include the citation as well. So your notes are really important, not only to improve this process, because some particular screening studies have done one level of title and abstract screening, but then as a group they went back and said, no, let's do this again. So there's lots of flexibility. We just want to be transparent, and they want to limit the amount of bias as well. How many citations do we screen, include, exclude, end up with? Well, we kind of talked about this. We don't know until we start. We're going to start with maybe less than 1,000, then move to 500. It's a craft and it's an art. Usually I find as few final citations as 7 to 10 to 12. I worked with a study just this past week with 52, and I've seen as many 134. We won't know, but this will be a team decision of how many citations do we include or exclude. Another question you may have, screening is taking forever. Is this just me? Well, it does take forever. You're anxious, you want to get started, you've got 700 to do, and you go through the first 50, and you go, well, that just took an hour. They say you should be able to screen, on average, 100 citations an hour. So it kind of gives you a bulk idea. If we have 700, it should take you 7 hours to do your titles and abstract screening. It may take you less, maybe more. But again, remember, we want this to be appropriate. We don't want to introduce bias by doing it quickly. We want to provide transparency and do this consistently from all team members. So we want to take every citation seriously. So things that we need to talk about. Take a break if you need. Move through it. But we'll talk about this as a group before we jump in and do our screening. So here's your exercise. With each research study sample of citations and abstracts, and I'll send you this in a separate email, for each entry, and based on the screening criteria we showed you and you should have, decide to include, exclude, or maybe for each citation. I don't know how many I'm going to do because I haven't jumped in yet, but I'll probably include up to 10. Retain notes if that helps for each one, why you decided, what questions you have. Email me your decisions after you've done all 10 or less citations with a yes, no, include, exclude, or maybe. You decide what language you want to use. And do this separately. So don't email the group, just email me. And then when we meet together as a group, we'll discuss group decisions. So I'll give you the tally. We'll talk about your notes if you have any, and your experiences as a group, whether you found this easy, hard, and issues that we should resolve. And issues are kind of, well, are we answering the research question or questions? Are our screening criteria, are they good enough? Should they be changed or strengthened? We'll talk about that as a group. So I look forward to working with you. I'll send an email separately. So thanks for joining me with this particular, hopefully this helped you to do this particular exercise appropriately. Email me at any time if you have any.